Hello, my name is Gregory Orr. I'm your host today on The Writing Life, and it's my pleasure to be talking here with Stanley Kunitz. Stanley Kunitz is among the most honored of contemporary American poets. His Selected Poems was given the Pulitzer Prize in 1959, and since then his honors have been too numerous to mention, but I'll mention only the most recent, the National Medal for the Arts, which was awarded him by President Clinton this past October. In addition, Mr. Kunitz is an essayist and a translator. He's also one of the fabled teachers of poets in our time. And it's in this capacity as a teacher that I first met Stanley 23 years ago at Columbia University. Stanley, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to think that we're different than we were then and that we're also the same.
Yes, I would agree with you that we're different, but I also agree with you that we're the same. I well remember that on those occasions when you were sitting in my class and I was asking you the questions. Now you're sitting in that chair and asking me, and I hope I'll do as well as you did then.
Well, I'm sure you will. This summer, we were speaking on the phone, and you mused about what human purpose poetry serves in our time. Now, I've known you long enough to realize that a question of that magnitude and seriousness as an opening question is not too much. And so I thought maybe I would ask you, what human purpose do you think poetry serves in our time?
The first thought that occurs to me is that poetry is most deeply concerned with telling us what it feels like to be alive at any given moment. In fact, if we go back historically, we find that if we want to know how people felt, how they lived, how they responded to experience, we have to turn to the poets of the past. Before there were poets, we have no evidence of what it was like to be a human being on this earth. And they were the first, and they still are, I think, the most intimate relators of what it means to be a living person on this earth. And then the other thought that occurs to me is that poetry, in its own way, is ultimately mythology, the telling of the stories of the soul in its adventure on this earth. That's simply saying in another form what I've already said, but giving it a somewhat wider context. And there's nothing else that quite serves that purpose in any of the arts or any other medium of communication.
I often think of your work as being visionary, and when I think of that, an early poem of yours comes to mind, which seems to me almost Blakean in its authority and compression, and that's the poem Open the Gates. I wonder if you might read that for us.
The opening vision of this poem, as I tried to understand it later, made me think of the plains of Sodom and Gomorrah out of the Bible, and why I was entertaining that vision I cannot say, but there it was. And here's the poem. Open the gates. Within the city of the burning cloud, dragging my life behind me in a sack, naked I prowl, scourged by the black temptation of the blood grown proud. Here at the monumental door, carved with the curious legend of my youth, I brandish the great bone of my death, beat once therewith, and beat no more. The hinges groan, a rush of forms shivers my name, wrenched out of me. I stand on the terrible threshold, and I see the end and the beginning in each other's arms.
Wonderful. Thank you. When I was writing a book on your work, a poem that became pivotal for me and has since fascinated me more and more is a poem called Father and Son, which, unless I'm mistaken, was written and published around 1934.
Approximately.
Approximately. Mm-hmm. The reason I mention that date is because it seems to me, and I've checked this with a number of scholars and people who accept challenges about poems, that it's the first time in English where the poet, where a poet addresses his father, where the poet in the guise of son addresses the father directly, and that intrigued me because it was as if you had discovered a new subject for poetry, and it's a subject that in our psychological century has engendered so many poems, and I think your poem began it, but one thinks of Theodore Roethke's poems, Lowell's, Sylvia Plath's, Berriman's. All of these poems seem to me, in some sense, to have been spawned by your poem. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, and if you might also read that poem for us.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm not sure that my poem spawned those others. Perhaps it was the climate of the age that made it possible for us to address our progenitors. And in other ages, that would have been thought indelicate and not suited to the high medium of poetry. Now in the suburbs and the falling light, I followed him. And now down sandy road, whiter than bone dust, through the sweet curdle of fields, where the plums dropped with their load of ripeness, one by one. Mile after mile I followed, with skimming feet, after the secret master of my blood, him steeped in the odor of ponds, whose indomitable love kept me in chains. Strode years, stretched into bird, raced through the sleeping country where I was young, the silence unrolling before me as I came, the night nailed like an orange to my brow. How should I tell him my fable and the fears? How bridge the chasm in a casual tone, saying, the house, the stucco one you built, we lost. Sister married and went from home, and nothing comes back. It's strange from where she goes. I lived on a hill that had too many rooms, light we could make, but not enough of warmth. And when the light failed, I climbed under the hill. The papers are delivered every day. I am alone and never shed a tear. At the water's edge, where the smothering ferns lifted their arms, Father, I cried, return. You know the way. I'll wipe the mud stains from your clothes. No trace, I promise, will remain. Instruct your son, whirling between two wars, in the Gemara of your gentleness. For I would be a child to those who mourn, and brother to the foundlings of the field, and friend of innocence, and all bright eyes. Oh, teach me how to work, and keep me kind. Among the turtles and the lilies, he turned to me, the white, ignorant hollow of his face.
That's an extraordinary poem.
I know people are shocked by that ending, have always been, still are.
It's a fierce and uncompromising ending, it really is.
Yeah. Remember that I was a young man when I wrote that poem, and I was rebelling against an older generation, both torn with love and broken with the desire to escape from the past, to make a new life. And I think all that enters into the passion, as you phrase it, of that poem.
And again, the combination of dream and vision, each of both.
Again, this is a poem that opening sequence of the road, the moonlit road, and the father image preceding me down. All that came out of a dream too.
Yeah. I know you've frequently spoken about a kind of a touchstone for your work, which is the phrase "to convert life into legend."
Yes.
And I know that's related to mythology. Would you, what you were calling myth earlier, maybe could you speak a little about that?
Yeah, well, the problem with the life is that it is so transient and in so many respects so meaningless against the great panorama of history and the cosmos itself. We are such small creatures. And one of the destinations of the poem, or the aspirations of the poem, is to make that life important, to justify the existence, to magnify what has happened to us so that it becomes for others emblematic, or in the other term, legendary.
And yet, one of the most fascinating turns in your work was in a later book, The Testing Tree. And I think, again, when we're speaking here about the quest for the Father, which is a theme in your work, a poem called The Portrait, where even as it aspires to the legendary and something that goes beyond the transient of the individual life, a poem like The Portrait embeds itself even more than any of your other work up until then in the details, what you might have called in Open the Gates the curious legend of my youth. Strange circumstances animate that poem. I wonder if you might read that one for us.
Well, this was the period, let me say, before I read that poem, when I began to feel that ordinary experience was also wonderful and mysterious, and it could be made, how shall I phrase it? It could be made resonant simply by being precise enough about the details and the reverberations of that experience within you.
Baudelaire speaks about that at one point. He says that there are certain moments when when all the details of experience suddenly radiate meaning, so that the entire scene becomes a symbol, which for him is, again, that word.
I sometimes think that the work of the poet in our time is to make ordinary experience beautiful in the grand sense, not in the pretty sense. Beautiful, mysterious, and terrible, as it all is. My mother never forgave my father for killing himself. especially at such an awkward time and in a public park that spring when I was waiting to be born. She locked his name in her deepest cabinet and would not let him out, though I could hear him thumping. When I came down from the attic with the pastel portrait in my hand of a long-lipped stranger with a brave mustache and deep brown level eyes, she ripped it into shreds without a single word and slapped me hard. In my 64th year, I can feel my cheek still burning, as I can in my 88th year too.
And I you know, whenever I show that poem to my students, and I say to them, can you remember that first experience of unjust punishment when your sense of self was and justice in the world was violated, and it's such a vivid moment, a moment that still is palpable on the body.
Because I've never felt that my mother was punishing me.
No.
She was punishing him.
Yeah.
And I was the visible remnant.
As indeed the description of the portrait of a stranger with a brave mustache seems, and deep brown level eyes, seems to me a self-portrait as well, a conscious portrait, both perhaps of your father in that picture, but also of you as I knew you in your 70th year, I guess was about when I met you. I wonder if you might also read what I take to be a companion poem to that, a poem that appears next to it in that volume, The Tasting Tree, called An Old Cracked Tune.
Perhaps I should say that during the period I was writing these poems, the portrait and An Old Cracked Tune, I was trying, I think, to work with deliberately domestic materials, because I felt that the age of military heroes, the famous adventurers, that was no longer with us, that the heroism to celebrate belonged in the home, in the workplace, and that domestic heroism deserved as much attention from the poetic imagination as the heroism in wars and in other such adventures. So, not that I rationalize it in that way, but this is my afterthought about it. And I was also concerned with the sense that the poet in our society is at best a marginal creature outside the mainstream and the primary American myth which pertains to success and power. The poet, in that sense, remains marginal, which does not mean that he is not concerned with central materials that should be central in a different age. So that's some of the afterthoughts about this poem. Because when I was writing it, all I was concerned with was the little details that you do not think of in relation to their interpretations. And if you did, you would never write the poem.
Write it all.
An Old Cracked Tune. My name is Solomon Levi. The desert is my home. My mother's breast was thorny, and father I had none. The sands whispered, be separate. The stones taught me, be hard. I dance for the joy of surviving on the edge of the road.
I love those last lines.
The important word
Dance
there is
for the
edge.
joy.
That's the marginal.
But I also hear the joy
Connection.
of surviving as being something people sometimes say to me, oh,
Yeah.
but Stanley's work is so fierce and grim. And I say, yes, but there's the joy of surviving. There's that exulting as I go, and you say at one point in another poem like that. I'm thinking about shifting now to another important aspect of your work and your life, which is your relationship to the natural world. And
Yeah, we haven't discussed that.
no,
at
and
all.
it wouldn't be right if we didn't. And I'm thinking also not just of the
You'd
natural
have
world.
only part of me if you didn't discuss that.
Well, there's little chance of capturing all of you in this time, but what we'll do is what we can do. I'm thinking also of gardening and how important that's been to you, and I've been among your wonderful gardens. A poem like Snakes of September. I wonder if you might read that.
The garden to me is a kind of allegory of human experience. And one of the things I love about gardening is that we reenact in that garden, toiling, grubbing in the soil year after year, the whole story of death and resurrection, the great rituals of the year and of human existence. And it's all there, and we are partners in it. We are like God, if we can imagine him, involved in the creation. And there is a kind of ecstasy about every inch of the gardening experience, even including the weeding and the grubbing and the dirt. To me, all of it is a wonderful and joyous experience.
You once said you'd rather garden than write a poem.
I certainly would, any day.
Well, if it's an ecstatic experience, that makes sense.
Yeah.
They're related.
The thing I want to add about the garden, this garden of mine is built on 5 terraces on a sandy hill. It was pure sand when I started it, and I had to create the soil in it in order to plant anything. It's become a real show garden now, and it is luxurious, and all sorts of creatures share the garden with me. And my favorite creatures are the snakes, the garden snakes. They're all over the place. They've found a happy home, and they know that I am a partner with them, that I have no animosity or fear of them. And in fact, they even permit me to stroke them, as I do in this poem. They live in the Alberta spruces. Somehow they've found them very congenial habitats, and each of my Alberta spruces contains families of snakes. And in the noonday sun, especially towards the end of summer, when the chill is coming on and the snakes are getting ready to hibernate, they come out on the sides, branches of the spruces and hang down. And that's when they are most permissive about letting me show my friendship with them. So this is the poem, The Snakes of September. All summer I heard them rustling in the shrubbery, outracing me from tier to tier in my garden, a whisper among the viburnums, a signal flash from the hedgerow, a shadow pulsing in the barberry thicket. Now that the nights are chill and the annuals spent, I should have thought them gone, in a torpor of blood, slipped to the netherworld before the sickle frost. Not so. In the deceptive balm of noon, as if defiant of the curse that spoiled another garden, these two appear on show through a narrow slit in the dense green brocade of a North Country spruce, dangling head down, entwined in a brazen love knot. I put out my hand and stroke the fine, dry grit of their skins. After all, we are partners in this land, co-signers of a covenant. At my touch, the wild braid of creation trembles.
The wild braid of creation trembles. It's wonderful. Thank you. We only have time for one more poem. I wonder if you might read The Longboat, Stanley.
The Longboat goes back to a Viking legend of their ceremony of putting the departed on a boat and sending it out to sea. That was a form of burial ritual. The Longboat. When his boat snapped loose from its moorings, under the squeaking of the gulls, he tried at first to wave to his dear ones on shore, but in the rolling fog, they had already lost their faces. Too tired even to choose between jumping and calling, somehow he felt absolved and free of his burdens. Those mottos stamped on his name tag, conscience, ambition, and all that caring. He was content to lie down with the family ghosts in the slop of his cradle, buffeted by the storm, endlessly drifting. Peace, peace, to be rocked by the infinite, as if it didn't matter which way was home, as if he didn't know he loved the earth so much he wanted to stay forever.
Stanley, thank you very, very much for talking with us. And I'd like to also thank you for joining us today on The Writing Life, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you, Greg. It's been a joy being with you.